Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are ready for our next presentation, and I'm excited to introduce our next presenter. After completing his master's in public policy and international affairs in 2016, Jeremy Levine became an adjunct professor at multiple universities in New York and New Jersey, teaching in a variety of different fields, including political science, sociology, business, economics, and statistics. Jeremy has taught mathematics for the W.E.B. Du Bois Scholars Institute at Princeton University and designed a series of courses for the NYU School of Professional Studies that have focused on topics like the Mueller investigation, the Kremlin, between Peter the Great and Vladimir Putin, the rise of China, the Syrian civil war, and the regional rivalry in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In fall 2022, Jeremy began his PhD journey in sociology at Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York. And with that, I give you Jeremy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. I have a little PowerPoint just to kind of go along with what I'll be talking about today. It'll help put some faces to names that I reference and things like that, and be a good visual, give some good visualizations. So what my chapter focused on for this book is the human rights implications on a global scale when it comes to sports. So when it comes to who's hosting the Olympics, who's hosting the World Cup, or who owns some of the professional teams in many of the Western professional sports leagues, over the last 20, 30 years, really since the end of the Cold War and really since the era of globalization that we find ourselves in has really taken off, and the internet, telecommunications, social media and everything, global finance expanding as well. Things are more integrated now than ever before. And I love sports. I follow all different sports. I have my favorite teams and everything and favorite players. And I believe it can really do, I believe sports can do one of two things. It'll either be the driver of change, or it could be a reflection of the changes that occur in society. So whether it's like the US Women's World Cup team of 1999, the Title IX girls, and the impact they had, or Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, professional baseball, sports can do a lot of good. What I'm going to talk about is where sports has not done as much good, you can say, over the last 20, 30 years. I'm going to highlight examples of China, Russia, and also the Middle East when it comes to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. Yeah, so let's get into that. Let me hide this and kind of break it down little by little. So of course, the chapter is a little bit more in depth, but I'm going to highlight different points that you can find throughout the chapter to kind of take us through the whole thing. So really, you get the end of the Cold War, you get the collapse of the Soviet Union, communism, maybe not everywhere, but in many places disintegrates, and you get the spread of capitalism and global capitalism. And a lot of people, a lot of scholars, the real famous one is Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, but many others too, were very optimistic about the spread of democracy, the spread of liberalism, human rights, also expanding along with that. And it's not to be critical of those thinkers and scholars. Being hindsight, it's very easy to look at something in hindsight. There were a lot of reasons to perhaps feel that way, but regardless, that has not happened. And so as, again, the last 20, 30 years has progressed, we're seeing capitalism and democracy, or for our purpose, human rights, are not exactly synonymous. And capitalism itself has far exceeded, when it comes to expansion, any of the other things that I was just referencing. So again, much of that early optimism has been incorrect. And one of the things that we've seen is the emergence of what some call authoritarian capitalism. So that's what I call it in the chapter, but you might also see it as bureaucratic capitalism. Ian Bremmer from the Eurasia Group calls it state capitalism, but it's all the same thing. And so basically what it's saying is that there are state apparatuses, particularly authoritarian regimes, that use the markets in different facets. So we're going to talk about sports and finance a little, that to solidify their rule, make the people and the citizenry under them even more dependent on them, for any kind of economic prosperity. And so the countries I had, like, so you get the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia, but now you have Russia under Vladimir Putin. China is still run by the Communist Party, obviously, but it's not exactly the same as Mao's China. You also get the authoritarian regimes, whether it's the royal family in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, which particularly Dubai will focus on, also Qatar. You get a bizarre balance between markets and the state, and where a lot of economic textbooks and chapters, you often have to like pick one or the other. We get a weird blend here between the two, and none of this for human rights has been good. And this has really played out over the last couple decades in sports with, again, that negative impact on human rights. Again, some of the examples we just highlighted: Vladimir Putin's, the Saudi royal family, much of the rulers in the Middle East, the Communist Party in China, even getting outside of sports, like how the latest tech crackdowns in China regarding the tech companies and Jack Ma and some of the people trying to make sure that nobody gets bigger than the party that's in control. You have the oligarchs in Russia, which we're going to highlight a little bit because some of them do own professional sports teams. We'll get into the invasion of Ukraine a little too. And then many of the things happening in the Middle East, whether it's the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, while you get the LIV golf tour that's Saudi-backed, Formula One in the UAE and the grave human rights conditions that are occurring there. Countless examples of this that we will go through. So again, you get Xi, and I know the thing cuts off a little bit, but President Xi in China and Putin here, who recently met. You get the two leaders of the crown princes of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. You have Messi here leading Argentina to victory in the World Cup with one of the Qatari leaders here as well. So these have become some of the faces of this. So, like, for example, China hosted the 2008 Summer Olympics and also the 2022 Winter Olympics. And there's a whole lot of money to be made for a whole lot of people. China, especially in 2008, you could say, like, arrives on the global stage in many ways, but we're overlooking Tiananmen Square, we're overlooking the Uyghur concentration camps, the constant threats to Taiwan, especially now that President Xi is telling the government to prepare for war. The whole idea was, as the Cold War came to an end, was that many of these countries would enter the fold and they would change politically, perhaps, or they would soften up on a lot of these things, or they would embrace human rights as we kind of see it in the world order that we have. And that has not happened. If anything, it's gone the other direction. Because a country like China that has over 1 billion people in it, it's a huge, massive market. And so if you are a sports team, if you are any kind of business, you really have to do what the Chinese government tells you to do, or you're going to have a problem. Like, you can criticize Trump or Biden or whoever's in the White House, Obama, Bush, whoever, and you're not going to have any consequences. But here in China, there's so much leverage here that they don't have to do things the way we perhaps expected them to do. An example of this was, I think kind of cuts off there, but Daryl Morey, who's now the GM of the general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers, when he was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, it was right around the time where the Hong Kong protests were at their peak, and he put out a tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," and people tweet stuff like this all the time. It's not really given much of a thought here, but it really, really upset the Chinese government to the point that Houston Rockets games were no longer aired on TV. They were demanding that the Houston Rockets fire Daryl Morey because the NBA is deeply in bed with doing business in China. They send teams to play in China all the time. Really started when Yao Ming got drafted about 20 years ago. A lot of money was lost because of this tweet. So not only do you have grave human rights situations in a particular country or part of the world, but the power is in China's hands to the point where it can really tell us here how we can and cannot exercise our own constitutional rights. And so if for any of us in academia or in the business world or sports world, like if you write or say something that upsets a foreign government, any government, and they are involved in some capacity with where you are working, they could potentially have you fired or removed from your position or demoted. Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights is supposed to protect us from those kind of things from our own government, but the idea that a foreign government can punish us for simply just expressing something is sort of where we're at. But again, this is what I would argue the inevitable result of doing business in China. The NBA, whether it's the NBA or China has the leverage here. And if you don't play by their rules, they will tell you to leave the country, and then you miss out on the massive market and potential money-making opportunities that exist. So that's just one example where it can actually come back and hurt us here or really anywhere else outside of China. You get into Russia, which hosted the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, and then about roughly a month later, it invades Ukraine and illegally annexes Crimea. And then it was still allowed to host the 2018 World Cup. And then shortly after the 2022 Olympics in China, it went for the full invasion of Ukraine. So like allowing these countries to host these events and make the money that they do and put the countries on the map and give them the credibility and the prestige is not making the world better. It's not improving human rights situations either. You're almost in a way rewarding really bad behavior. And I don't want it to seem like, oh, you can only host the World Cup or only host the Olympics in like New York or London. Like, that's not what I'm saying, but I feel like there needs to be like a limit here. Like if bringing these countries and bringing these regimes into the fold is upending the global order, is making human rights worse, given the kidnapped Ukrainian children, everything else that's gone on there, perhaps we need to change course, even if there's money to be made. And my bachelor's was in finance. Like, I don't mean to sound like naive or money doesn't matter, but there has to be like a line here, in my opinion. And so that's what I kind of explained in the chapter, that you allow Vladimir Putin to host these events. There's a lot of corruption when it comes to the oligarchs and who's in control of this and who's running that and moving the money offshore, all that kind of stuff. And nothing in the world this does not make the world any better whatsoever. And it's not just hosting international events like Gazprom, the energy company that's always threatening to try to like freeze Europe, was a sponsor for a German soccer team. You have one of the oligarchs, Roman Abramovich, who was the owner of Chelsea Football Club for quite a long time, up until the war, and then they sold it, whether he was forced to or just did it because it was unpopular to own it. You could debate. But you have a lot of money, and when you get so intertwined, see, one of the things about globalization that's supposed to make it a good thing, and I'm not anti-globalization, but when you intertwine and you interconnect, whether it's countries or businesses, whatever, you're supposed to make the world more stable, because it's not worth causing such economic pain and heartache to make whatever kind of irrational decision you're thinking of making. And so this should have brought Europe and Russia closer together. And when everybody's making money, an invasion like Ukraine should never have happened. That in no economic globalization sense should that have occurred. But you're counting on Putin or some of these regimes to make rational decisions based on economic theory about comparative advantage and everything, and it's not something we can count on. And again, the human rights catastrophes as a result of this, and fans don't care. Like, fans have their favorite team, and since he's bought Chelsea's won a bunch of championships. Like, a lot of people don't really pay attention to this, But hopefully the events of the last year or two are change that a little, and we start focusing a little bit more on who owns what and where the money is coming from, whether it's domestically or especially foreign when it comes to professional sports leagues in the West. You also have Saudi Arabia, which I get into. So one of the other emergences besides, if I just backtrack a little, with authoritarian capitalism is you're getting sovereign wealth funds. They're called, so they're kind of like a hedge fund, private equity fund-esque, but they're very state controlled. Like the government controls them, operates them, and decides where investments are going to be made. And there are exceptions of these, not in authoritarian societies, like Norway has one. But this is one of the means by which these regimes have been able to like enter and penetrate different markets around the world, whether it's this, and the Saudis are a really good example of this, given how much money they have, with how much money they just gave Jared Kushner's private equity fund, Steve Mnuchin's private equity fund as they all left the White House. They're active investors in companies like Uber and Twitter, I think Disney, Apple, Amazon. I have to double check that, but definitely Uber and Twitter. Like they're major shareholders. And so not only are they getting involved with finance, but they're also getting involved in the world of sports, one of which is the LIV Golf Tour, which again may not sound like a big deal if the PGA Tour has a little competition. And maybe the LIV Golf Tour can cause the PGA Tour to maybe make some more changes to help the players a little more. But when you look at the business model of the LIV Golf Tour, it's highly suspect. Like no player, whether you finish first or last, nobody makes less than $120,000. And there's no like, you don't make the cut. Like in the PGA Golf Tour, if you don't make the cut, you're not getting paid. LIV Golf Tour, even if you come in last, you're getting like $120,000. So it's not the most profitable venture in the world. And if you're not in it to make money, why are you in this business? Perhaps to extend your influence, which for as much as Democrats and Republicans in Washington don't agree on anything, when some of the major US golfers who have been pushing this tour, like Greg Norman and others, testify before Congress, they've all come to like an agreement where they're starting to think like maybe all these people need to register as foreign agents with the Department of Justice. Like it's getting that suspicious looking. And so how's, again, the PG, like, because a lot of sports commentators will talk about petition, this is capitalism, let the better tour win. But all the sports commentators talking about this are not talking about the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, are not talking about the war in Yemen, are not talking about, maybe this isn't all about money necessarily. And so in the sports world, and partially because nobody in sports wants to talk about politics, but they're missing a big part of the apple here. And so this is worth keeping an eye on, because again, we're overlooking the grave human rights conditions in Saudi Arabia when perhaps we should be working on not being in bed with them as much as some members on both sides of the aisle in Washington have suggested. But this golf tour is a cause for concern. The other thing too, in the world of soccer, they've signed Ronaldo, and there's talk now about signing Messi to a club. And you want to pay, I think Ronaldo makes like almost $300 million a year. Like that's not like the whole contract divided up by a bunch of years, like per year, a crazy amount of money. Same thing with Messi. Like if he ends up going there, it's going to be well over 200 million per year. No athletes make that much money per year in any of the professional sports. So again, where is this money coming from? And is this something we should be encouraging? It's worth asking those questions. They've also bought Newcastle United. So while British soccer has been slowly working to kick Russian money out, it's welcoming money from the Middle East. And then the PIF is the Public Investment Fund that I was just talking about. So if you're going to kick out one due to a war and human rights and everything, to welcome the other, which in some cases you could probably argue has a worse record on things, is a little suspicious in my opinion. United Arab Emirates, another country with a very, very poor human rights record, but here it hosts one of the major Formula One F1 racing circuits each year. And then on the right here, this gentleman here, Sheikh Mansour, is the owner of Man City, Manchester City Football Club. So again, as we're kicking Russian money out of the equation, we're welcoming into our professional sports money from other authoritarian, corrupt regimes. And again, a lot of people don't care because their teams are winning now. Nobody's ever even heard of Manchester City before this guy like burst onto the scene. And now them and Chelsea and others are some of the major clubs that win a lot. But there are consequences for this. The human rights situations are not getting any better. Just after I wrote the chapter, it just happened recently, so I don't cite it specifically, but you have like the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates has just gone to Syria and he wants to help Assad rebuild. So forget about all the chemical weapons and massacres and everything. A lot of the money that is going to be made in this equation probably ends up helping us Bashar al-Assad rebuild Syria, despite everything that's happened there over the last decade. So again, really bad human rights consequences for involving who we have chosen to involve in our world of sports. And then lastly, Qatar. I didn't want to go super in depth in the World Cup because I think I saw there was somebody wrote a whole chapter on it specifically. But you do have the Qatari Investment Authority, which is its large investment fund, sovereign wealth fund. It got a little caught up in the Mueller investigation at one point, for anybody who was keeping an eye on that. But within the Qatari Investment Authority, you have the Qatar Sports Investments, you could say, division. And they are the owners now, or the main owners of Paris Saint-Germain, which is one of the main soccer clubs in France. And one of the people that encouraged Qatar and pushed Qatar to acquire Paris Saint-Germain was former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who's also the same guy that was involved in the FIFA bribery scandal a little bit, and was also the leader that told Ukraine a whole while back that it couldn't join NATO. Him and Merkel said you can't join NATO, and the world would be a lot different had France and Germany perhaps had a different opinion on that. So there's a lot of corruption there with significant human rights consequences as a result. And then Qatar it has also started sponsoring, just like Gazprom. This is Barcelona, FC Barcelona in Spain, Qatar Airways. So you'll see that. And I think they're on more soccer clubs now too. So to kind of conclude just with the last few minutes, again, I love sports. I think it still does so much good for the world, whether it's international events that bring countries and people together, whether it's our own professional sports leagues, and again, either the change that it drives or the change in society that you can see reflected in sports, I think is wonderful and I hope continues. But there has been a little bit of a dark side that has emerged since the end of the Cold War, since this era that we now find ourselves in of globalization and global capitalism. Again, this isn't like an anti-capitalism presentation either, but there are consequences that I feel are worthy of discussion. And I hope this book and this chapter kind of shines a light on it more and brings it to light. Because again, in the sports media, sports commentary world, everybody just talks about the sports element, but nothing else. And those outside of sports don't talk about this as much, or maybe don't care. Like if you don't like sports, or you've been paying attention to this, but I do think it interconnects with so many things that have happened in the world and are currently happening in the world. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Obviously, I hope you check out the chapter as of the book as well. Yeah, and if anybody has any comments, questions, wants to discuss anything, I would love to chat more on this. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jeremy. You're clearly an authority on this subject, and it's certainly concerning that authoritarian governments are sports washing, right, to legitimize their regimes. That was fantastic. I appreciate the photo at the beginning that you have with the soccer players meeting the leaders. One of the young people I work with loves Messi. I didn't know much about Messi until this youth started talking about him. And you talk about being a sports lover, or you acknowledge that sports can be really powerful for folks. And then there's also this other dark side. So I'm just wondering, how do you think you could explain this to people that maybe aren't involved in politics, or even to young people? How do you legitimize their love for sport, but then also help them navigate this cognitive dissonance in a way that by supporting the World Cup, are they supporting these human rights abuses in effect? What do you think about that?
That's a great question, and it's so tough because even I was still kind of tuning into the World Cup, and I tuned into the Olympics. So I don't think you could just say don't watch these events or don't support Messi because he shook hands with someone who's terrible. I don't think that will resonate with a lot of people, young or old. I'm not sure it would resonate with me because even and I as you watch this, I do still feel kind of guilty, I should go jump in the shower or something when I'm done. But I think you can educate people on what it is. I think you can show them what it is. Somewhat allow them to make opinions for themselves, but I think if the point can be stressed that this impacts your life, that might be, I think, the best way to go about it. Because when I'm watching sports fandom, it is kind of irrational. When my favorite team wins, I'm happy. When my favorite team loses, I'm not happy. But in reality, it doesn't really impact my life, so to speak, my job, my responsibilities, or anything else. But if you can show, if people can be shown that this kind of stuff impacts your life, or this kind of stuff is impacting what your government is doing or is not doing, I think that might be the better way to kind of educate people on this. Because if you villainize Messi, you're not going to get Messi just wants to win a World Cup. I'm not even sure if he's paying attention to everything that's happening over there, or any of the other sports or athletes I'm talking about. People have jobs, they get paid to do this. The players don't necessarily pick where these events are held. Same thing with Olympic athletes, or if you're a player for one of these teams, I don't know if they were asked to Gazprom sponsor it. So maybe you can't villainize everyone or everything, but if you can make it as personal as you can to show why you should care, and by caring, you might be able to impact your own life in a positive way, I think that might be the best way to go. That might not be the perfect way to go. I don't know if there's a perfect way, but I think that's the best way I can answer what is a really good and important question.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not even sure that, there is a perfect answer yet, or will be, but I appreciate just entertaining that question. We have, just as you were talking, I had this imagery of, sports fans being excited over whether folks win or lose. And yet there's always going to be losers when it comes to human rights. There's always people having their rights violated. So regardless of that excitement or feeling let down, there's always going to be a group that's even more, violated.
Exactly. And geopolitics isn't a black and white kind of thing. It's complicated. There's layers. We deal with countries that don't have the best human rights records. We punish human rights violators maybe more than others. It's messy. It gets dicey. There's a lot of gray. But given everything that's happened the last couple of years, I think the way we've been trying to go about things and balance things just hasn't worked. This is not the only reason, but part of the reason. So I just think we need a new course.
Thank you. We do have a question from our audience. So authoritative regimes seem to be using sport to manipulate the public's support. It seems to be a form of exploitation. Is there anything that can be done to curb it?
I think it requires a massive amount of people to say, no, we don't want this. And that's hard because there's nothing directly people can, like, these are private businesses. People can buy franchise. I mean, if you have the money, because it's very expensive, but like you can buy a sports franchise really from anywhere, like legally, probably not. It requires, I think, a groundswell, grassroots sort of movement from the bottom up. And I think what happened with Roman Abramovich here is a good example of that. Nobody cared before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine that Roman Abramovich owned Chelsea. I have friends who are big British soccer fans, and they didn't even know his name, but I remember everybody thought it was funny that a Russian warlord owned a British soccer team. Like, he's not a warlord, but that was like the narrative where, oh, he flies in with like bulletproof helicopters. And I'm not even sure if that was all true, but it was like everybody thought it was like kind of cool. And if you were a Chelsea fan who's won a few Premier Leagues over the last recent years, you didn't care. All of a sudden, Putin invades Ukraine, and then there was a groundswell. Roman Abramovich has got to go. And I think the British were going to like take the team if he didn't sell it. But that required a groundswell of pressure. So it was kind of unfortunate that it took a massive invasion to get to that point. But I think it shows that if people actually care and push hard enough, that you can make a positive change, because money talks. And if money starts to dry up and it comes from the fans, I guess you can argue TV deals and stuff too. But what fans or just people can do on their end, I think can make a difference. And I think we saw that recently.
Thank you. You talked about potential retaliation from foreign governments against academics. And as you well know, there are many cases of retaliation against people who are critical of nations and leaders for their human rights abuses. And you write about autocratic nations that have been, documented for their abuses. And I admire your courage for that. I'm curious if you're ever concerned about backlash for yourself from these nations.
I guess in theory, I don't know like how prominent I am. Like, I don't know if I'm like on their radar yet, but if you talk and speak enough on something, you will get somebody's attention. Whether like all of a sudden you can't come here or something, I guess in theory, and maybe it crosses my mind once in a while. But it's just something that I think has to get done. And like, I would love to visit, like I love history. There's things to go and see in all those countries. And I think many of those countries do have the potential to offer a lot of good things to the world. I just think those in power are doing otherwise. So I guess in theory, somebody at some point can say something or try to take some action, but I'm probably just going to keep writing and speaking and doing what I'm doing and just trying to exercise my own constitutional rights here. And I hate when people beat like the Constitution over the head like that. But yeah, that's just how I'm going to treat it. And people might be worried then, like, oh, if I write something or like, because somebody in my program is not from one of these countries, but from another repressive regime. And there's something that he wants to work on. And he came in the office one day because the first years all share the same office, like kind of worried about, is his home country going to retaliate against him? Like, that is possible and significantly more extreme than where I'm not from any of these countries. So unless I like start speaking out against Putin in Russia, like I should be okay. So there's different levels to this issue too. But yeah, I guess in theory, something, if I catch somebody's radar at some point, something can be said or done, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on that. We do have another question here in the chat. It says the US golf pros know that the bad stuff that the Saudis have done, yet they seem to put their morals and their support for human rights aside to take their money. Is there any way to shame them, such as actions send to the public, especially young athletes, to send them a bad message? So I guess this idea of, inspiring people, the fans.
It's tough because it's so much money that's being thrown where it's almost like, how do you say no? Or if you were in there, like, it's very easy to say, if I was in their shoes, I would not take it when millions are being handed to you. I kind of think of, especially, I'm sure people still cheat and use steroids, but like in the heart of steroids in baseball and how villainized the many of the players were, which of course they were cheating. It was an unfair advantage, but some of the other players have said, if you took steroids to boost your stats and you got paid millions of dollars in your next contract as a result of your inflated numbers, it's hard to say you wouldn't do something like that. I think it's a similar case here where I'm sure, I agree with the person who asked the question, like, they know most of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, the human rights is abysmal, the war in Yemen, one thing after the next, but it's so much money that it's almost hard to say no. What I hope is, like Tiger Woods said no. Like, if enough of them say no, enough of the big names say no, thank you, and take that high road, I hope that's what the kids and young people in general will see and gravitate to, that enough prominent people are saying no, I can say no too. Because it's hard, because that is like, what can people do? That's a tough one, because it depends if you think they're in the business of making money. Like the soccer, Romano Abramovich was in the business of making money. So when everybody got upset that he's the owner, all of a sudden, when it wasn't going to be as profitable anymore, he was like, all right, I'll leave. Here, if it's more about spreading influence, and the losses that the tour's already taken on are staggering, it's hard to shame and put public pressure on people whose top motive is not money. But that's why I think that might have to be a more top-down approach. Either the U.S. government has to step in and make people register as foreign agents under FARA and all these different kind of things, or enough of the golfers, Tiger Woods and more, have to say, no, we're not doing this. Maybe we're open to making some changes on our own tour, the PGA Tour, but we can't take that extra step and just leave and join this new creation.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. On the topic of money, you stated that sports organizations, when they host these sport events, if you're not into this to make money, why are you doing this? And you use that as evidence for sports washing. But then it's interesting for athletes. We hear about, like, the Paralympics we heard about earlier, that athletes often lose money. They actually need to pay to play. So it's almost a different standard for athletes than it is these hosting organizations. If athletes were just in it for the money, that might be considered poor sportsmanship, for example. So I just thought it was interesting how there is
a double standard there, where if you're told as an athlete you're only in it for the money, then you're not in it for the love of the game and you get criticized. But on the other side, if you're the owners, it's sort of a different narrative that we've kind of become numb to and accept the sports washing term as a great term to kind of describe it. So yeah, there's always, like, whether it's in any industry, I guess the people on top and the labor, there's always like a double standard, how we perceive one or what we accept. Okay, they can do this, but the others can do that. Unfortunately, there is that element in this too.
And that wasn't a criticism so much as to say, I think it matters where you are, it seems, from what you're telling us, but where you are, like, what's your position in all of this? That really matters, that viewpoint.
100%.
I'm looking in our chat. I don't have any other questions from the chat. Let me just see if I was taking some notes here. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other, parting thoughts for us? If we'll see if anybody puts anything else in the chat, but.
I guess with parting thoughts, trying to think what people should maybe keep an eye on. I think anything involving more the Middle East nations right now is worth keeping an eye on, because we're starting to see not only all the different sports things I talked about, but now you're starting to see some of the other countries like China are flexing their muscle and bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and whether or not those countries will join BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Are you going to start expanding it? And so there's a whole geopolitical backscene to all this that I think is worth keeping an eye on and will absolutely impact, hopefully not for the worse, but probably, unfortunately, for the worst, the current human rights situation that's kind of find ourselves in, that sports is unfortunately playing a role in, and whether or not that leads to even deeper, further economic integration with this in sports. So I think that's where my attention and focus is currently.
Got it. Actually, no, I thought of one more thing. Just so where do you see your work going now? And where do you see your focus? You did this chapter for our book and you did this presentation. Where do you see your work going from here?
If I was to expand it outside of sports, I would get deeper into finance. And what happens if you have these sovereign wealth funds, or even just like a wealthy member of the Saudi family, for example? What if they are actually, one of them is an investor in Twitter, or an investor in this, or an investor in that, and there's a lot of user data? Well, how do I know that, like all the outrage about TikTok, well, how do I know user data isn't going to end up in the hands of these organizations and therefore governments, and cause the same national security / human rights issues as well with that? I think that is one area. And then if I was to stay within sports, it would probably stay in soccer, by the more international sports. Soccer is I played soccer a lot as a kid. I like soccer, but it's a real dirty game, you could say, in terms of money and who's running the show. Formula One, now that it's going more global, and global is also kind of getting its hands dirty a little bit. So my research will probably continue to follow those sports in particular. And then I guess the only other thing too is, like, when that Daryl Morey situation emerged, a lot of the NBA players, and I don't want to pick on NBA players, just athletes in general, were very like, we love China. We love China. We don't support that, or we don't know anything about what's going on in Hong Kong, even though you could just jump on Google really quick. Like, we don't know anything about that, because everybody has shoes made there. Everybody has business going on. The WWE is another example with Saudi Arabia, where I think it was John Cena had to apologize. One of the biggest wrestling stars had to apologize, I think either to China or Saudi Arabia, one of them, for comments he must have made. So this constant, like, international pressure and backlash that people here in the United States can endure as a result of speaking out abroad, I imagine that will continue. And that is something that's also I will be paying close attention to as well. So those, I know that they're very different, but those three areas is probably where I'm going to keep my focus.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to maybe some presentations on those topics. And
Sure.
Well, that is our time for today. Thank you very much, Jeremy Levine, for joining us and for sharing your presentation. And we wish you all the best with your PhD.
Thank you very much. Thank you.